Joint Defense.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Brooks.
Yes, thanks, Mona. Hi, Mr. Stoltenberg. Yesterday, you told us that you wanted to increase common funding for deterrence and defense spending, which is a good idea. So I wanted to ask you about that, not the amount, because we know that has to still be negotiated, but rather how the money might be spent and the way it would be decided. For instance, NATO's decision-making rules for common funding, as we all know, are rigid and slow. They're subject to multiple committee reviews and, most important, unanimous voting among the allies. So my question to you, very specific, do you consider that these approval procedures for common fund spending need to be reformed in a serious way in order to speed up defense and deterrence spending? And if you do think that, will you propose that at the summit? Thank you.
First of all, common funding is one among several proposals that are now discussed as part of the NATO 2030 agenda. And we had very positive and very good discussions over the last 2 days on the NATO 2030 initiative. And I'm very confident that when heads of state and government meet later on this year, they will agree a forward-looking, ambitious agenda for how to make NATO future-proof and how to continue to adapt the most successful alliance in history to become even stronger and even more able to cope with a wide range of threats and challenges. And I'm also confident because when we had a discussion yesterday on NATO 2030, I also sense very broad support for the idea that we need to agree substantive and concrete measures when it comes to, for instance, how to maintain our technological edge, how to make sure that we are responding to the security impact or consequences of climate change, how to make sure that we step up and are more concrete when it comes to resilience, making sure that we have reliable infrastructure, telecommunications, energy grids, and how we can step up and work even more closely with partners, both in our neighborhood but also in the Asia-Pacific, also to address the rise of China, to work with like-minded democracies, to protect the rules-based order, and of course also how to strengthen political consultation within the alliance to strengthen the political dimension. To do all of this and many more things, we need more resources. And that's the reason why I proposed increased common funding. There are different budgets in NATO. There is a civilian budget, investment budget, and a military budget. I think now the most important thing is to agree that we need more resources to do more. Then I think we need to come back to both the exact amounts and any specific details about how we make decisions. Consensus will always be the base for any decisions in NATO, but I am confident and I'm encouraged by the strong support for the NATO 2030 agenda and for having an ambitious forward-looking agreement when heads of state and government meet later on this year.
Okay, the next 3 questions will come from here in the room, and we'll go first to Steve Erlanger from New York Times.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. It's nice to see you in the flesh. For a change, it's nice. Given your discussion on Russia, the British have just published an integrated review and a military white paper of ambitious goals and modest resources. And they will have a military now of only 72,000 troops, which is the smallest in over 200 years, certainly smaller than Waterloo. And they're going to go into a long transition to become a different kind of force. Is this the UK that NATO wants? It didn't used to want this from the UK. It wanted more land-based forces. Or is this the UK NATO will have to live with? And will that long transition create vulnerabilities given the new threats you've just cited from Russia? Thank you.
The United Kingdom is a leading NATO ally, and they have a full spectrum defense, conventional, nuclear, cyber, many capabilities in all domains. Second, the United Kingdom is one of the allies which are spending now more than 2% and actually increasing significantly defense spending, going above 2%. I spoke with Prime Minister Johnson earlier this week. I also spoke with the Secretary for Defense Wallace and Secretary Dominique Raab, the Foreign Secretary. And they all conveyed the same message, that the United States and the United Kingdom is really committed and is ready to not only continue to be a strong and reliable NATO ally, but to step up and do more. On land, at sea, in the air, in cyberspace, and providing more advanced capabilities for NATO. I welcome that significant modernization. I welcome the increased investments. I also welcome the fact that NATO allies and the United Kingdom are working closer together when it comes to what we call capability targets, identifying what kinds of capabilities different allies should provide, and also the United Kingdom. So I'm actually encouraged by the integrated review and the messages coming out from the United Kingdom, because it demonstrates a will to step up and do even more. And that's what we see. And I think any comparison with Waterloo is absolutely meaningless, because the equipment and the investment and the soldiers today are totally different. So I really feel that the United Kingdom has demonstrated, not only in words but also in deeds, a commitment to be strong NATO ally with modern and extremely important capabilities for our alliance.
The next question will be all the way there, DPA Ansgar Hazen.
Poland will supply more than 3,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine to vaccinate all NATO headquarters staff in the coming days. Can you please tell us why you have accepted Poland's offer to provide these vaccines, despite the fact that this decision could risk the lives of people in Poland that are still not vaccinated? And can you please tell us also why these vaccines are not provided by countries that have already vaccinated larger parts of their population, like UK or the United States? Thank you.
So I welcome the Polish decision to provide the vaccines to NATO staff here at the NATO headquarters. I think that demonstrates Poland's commitment to NATO. It is an expression of solidarity and resilience, and solidarity and resilience is at the heart of our alliance. It will, of course, help us in our work here at the NATO headquarters. But of course, this is a Polish decision. I welcome the decision, and we look forward to start immunization of the vaccination of staff here at the headquarters.
Next question is Desislava Apostolova from Bulgarian TV, all the way there, the lady in green. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary-General, did the ministers discuss today the last tensions between Bulgaria and Russia after Bulgaria has expelled 2 Russian diplomats? And what is the message of the ministers in regards with this case, the message to Bulgaria and to Russia? Thank you.
First of all, I think that the message from NATO allies and also from me as Secretary General is a message of solidarity. And I spoke with the Bulgarian Prime Minister yesterday, and the Foreign Minister, she attended the Foreign Ministerial meeting today, and she raised the issue and briefed allies. Of course, we are closely following the investigation by the Bulgarian authorities into an alleged Russian spy ring. NATO takes protection of classified information very, very seriously, and we fully support the efforts by Bulgaria to tackle Russia's malign activities on its territory. And I think what we see in Bulgaria is a pattern of Russian behavior, where they try to undermine our democratic institutions, try to interfere in domestic politics, and also are stepping up within the intelligence domain. So this is part of a pattern, and that's also one of the reasons why it is important that we stand together, that we express solidarity, and that we work together also when it comes to intelligence, sharing information and helping each other.
We'll take one question online now from Andrzej Matysiak from Pravda. And I know there are a couple more in the room, so Andrzej, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. We have just seen Russia and China complaining about the sanctions that were mentioned in one of the questions previously asked. How this is perceived in NATO? Is it something? Would you say this is something like China and Russia trying to coordinate better their positions on a global scale? And what would it need? What would it mean for NATO? And in this context, would you say that NATO also need to strengthen the cooperation with the EU? We just had a conversation also with the EU partners. Thank you.
So, yes, I think that we should do more, work more closely with the European Union. We have been able to really strengthen the cooperation between the European Union and NATO over the last years, especially since 2014, and that's something I really welcome. Because neither NATO nor the European Union has all the tools needed to respond to malign activities by Russia or when we see also challenges coming from China. But together we can complement each other and support each other. And economic sanctions are an example of that. Of course, NATO does not agree economic sanctions. This is something that the EU and NATO allies, like the United States and other allies, do as individual nations. But of course, what NATO does is that we make sure that we are always delivering credible deterrence and defense, which is sending a very clear message to any potential adversary. We are stepping up when it comes to resilience, to technology, cyber defense, and so on. So we are working together, and that has always been important. But in one way, we are now faced with more non-military threats, where we see that it's not only the threat of a classical military attack, which is the only challenge, but cyber, economic, coercion, disinformation, what we always often refer to as hybrid warfare. When we are faced with all these different kinds of threats at the same time, then of course they need to work together and have many tools, political, diplomatic, economic, military, together. That becomes even more important. Again, that's part of the NATO 2030 agenda on resilience, on technology, on partnerships, but also one of the reasons why we also need to continue to strengthen the cooperation with the European Union.
I see one hand raised, Mark Carlson from Associated Press.
Mr. Secretary General, have you asked the U.S. to show Article 5-like solidarity and export vaccines to its allies?
There is a dialogue between allies on vaccines. NATO has not issued any formal request to allies, because this is also for export of vaccines, because this is an issue which is dealt with bilaterally or in discussions, for instance, with the European Union. What I welcome is that what I've seen over all allied countries is that across the whole NATO is that our military armed forces, they are helping and supporting the civilian efforts to cope and deal with the pandemic. United States, Canada, across Europe, we have seen how armed forces have helped to set up military field hospitals, transport equipment, medical personnel, patients, but also help to support the rollout of the vaccine. NATO is coordinating some of these efforts. We have helped to provide support to NATO allies and partners. So our armed forces, NATO, they are helping the civilian efforts in fighting the pandemic. But when it comes to the export and import of vaccines, that's not an issue that has been discussed within the NATO framework.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference, and hope to see you soon. Stay safe. Thank you.
nicht nur in den Testzentren der Fall sein, dass geimpft wird.
With our allies because we intend to work with them and our partners wherever and whenever we can. We share collective security, strategic interests, a long history, people-to-people ties, and a commitment to core values, including democracy, human rights, the rule of law. In short, we're in this together. That's the spirit of Article 5. That's the spirit of the United States commitment to NATO. Let me just say on a personal note, I'm very happy to be back in Brussels for my first visit as Secretary of State. I've been gratified by how our allies have welcomed America back to the table. We know that our return is being met with high expectations. We welcome that. In a few hours, I'll have an opportunity to speak here at NATO and go into greater depth about how the Biden administration will work with our allies and partners to advance our national security priorities around the world, so I invite you to stay tuned for that. But for now, let me just end by expressing my personal gratitude and the gratitude of the United States to Secretary-General Stoltenberg and everyone here at NATO headquarters for hosting us this week and doing it so well and so productively. And with that, happy to take a few questions.
Start with Jennifer Hansler.
Relayed what you heard on Afghanistan to President Biden yet? What was his reaction? And you said yesterday that you would leave together when the time is right. Is now the right time? And what would have to change in the about a month before May 1st to make it the right time to meet that deadline?
So, you know, as you know, as we've discussed already, we have this review underway, and I came here to do two things: to share some of the thinking that we have with our allies, but just as important, to hear from them, to consult with them, because that's what allies do. And indeed, I relayed back the views that I heard yesterday from our allies to the President. And I think that's going to be an important factor in informing his thinking about the way forward. We heard this the other week at the Defense Ministerial. We've heard this refrain as well this week, and it remains true. We went in together, we adjusted together, and when the time is right, we will leave together. And the common theme, as I noted the other day, is together, and that was re-emphasized in our meetings here this week. Again, last week the President noted it would be tough to meet the May 1 deadline for a full withdrawal, but whatever we end up doing, again, is going to be informed by the thinking of our allies, and tactical decisions aside, we're united with those allies in a few things, in making sure that as we move forward, we seek to bring a responsible end to the conflict, to remove our troops from harm's way, and to ensure that Afghanistan can never again become a haven for terrorists that would threaten the United States or any of our allies. So we're in very close consultation, very close coordination with our allies and partners. That was reinforced over the last 24 hours. And again, I think this will be extremely helpful in informing the President's thinking as we go forward.
We'll go to Steve Erlinger, New York Times.
Hey, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. You just had a long discussion about Russia, and there are lots of things I wanted to ask you, but what I'm going to ask you is, do you agree now, without an INF treaty in place, that there's a real nuclear vulnerability in Europe to Russian INF and even tactical nuclear weapons? And if you do, what's the right answer? And if you don't, does it mean that NATO still needs German nuclear sharing, which is becoming increasingly controversial there? Thank you.
Well, let me say this. We had a couple of things. We had a lengthy discussion about Russia this morning with our colleagues. And before getting to the specific question, I think a few things stood out. I think we all expect our relationship with Russia to remain a challenge into the foreseeable future, but it's one that we're prepared for. And ultimately, I think what we can hope is to have a relationship with Russia that is at least predictable and stable. And so, given that, our intent is to engage Russia in ways that advance our interests while remaining very clear-eyed about the challenges that it poses. So even as we work with Russia to advance our interests and advance alliance interests, we'll also work to hold Russia to account for its reckless and adversarial actions. I think we've already demonstrated that, particularly with the extension of New START for 5 years, but also with the actions we've already taken to hold Russia to account. But one of the areas where I think we have a clear mutual interest in seeing if we can work together is on strategic stability, to include all of Russia's nuclear weapon systems, including those that may not be covered by New START. And I think that's clearly in the interest of the United States, in the interest of our allies, and I can't speak for Russia, in Russia's interest too. So, Steve, that's what we'll be looking at when President Biden spoke to President Putin. They both did note the possibilities of exploring beyond the extension of New START where we might go on strategic stability, and again, that would have to encompass all of the systems that Russia possesses.
Go to Dan Michaels.
Dan Michaels with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First, if I could just quickly follow up on Afghanistan. Can you say what you've told your NATO allies about the timing of the administration's review, and what if the Taliban doesn't agree to an extension of the timeline? And second, if I may quickly, it's clear that the atmospherics here have improved. Are you at all concerned that allies will take that as a leeway to be a bit more relaxed about meeting some of the commitments that they've faced a lot of pressure on over the past 4 years? Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dan. Look, I don't want to get into hypotheticals about what the Taliban may or may not do, what we may or may not do. This is a very active review, and again, as I said, it's now fully informed by the views of our allies, and that was really what our goal was coming here, to make sure that we could do that. As you know as well, the diplomacy on Afghanistan has been moving forward, even as we've been reviewing the question of the May 1 deadline. We saw I think, very productive meeting in Moscow with the so-called Troika +1, Russia, China, Pakistan, the United States. The statement that came out from that meeting, I think, is important and significant in underscoring the view of all 4 countries, that it was important for the parties to accelerate their efforts at finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Afghanistan. Important that there be a reduction in violence, a clear rejection of the establishment or reestablishment of an emirate in Afghanistan. So there's a lot of common denominators among these 4 countries, which otherwise occasionally have their differences. So I think that's significant. And we're also tracking to a meeting hosted by Turkey in the coming weeks that would bring together leadership of the Afghan government and the Taliban, again, in an effort to advance on the diplomacy and to advance toward some kind of agreement for a peaceful political resolution of the conflict. So all of that is moving forward. You're right that I think we found a very positive reception here from allies and partners. So I'll take that for today and for this week. That may not last forever, but in all seriousness, it was extremely gratifying. But again, I think it starts with the fact that we expressed very clearly, and I expressed very clearly on behalf of President Biden, our commitment to this alliance and our determination to engage, to consult, to listen, to work together with our allies. But we also discussed in some detail the need not only to look at what NATO has to do to make sure it is engaged on the challenges of our time, not just the time the alliance was founded. We also discussed the need to properly resource that. Certainly, we believe strongly, the United States believes strongly that we do need to do that. Allies made commitments at the Wales Summit in 2014 that, in fact, they're making good progress on. But there are other aspects to this that are important. The financial commitments are significant. They're vital. They're important, and we're determined that we all see them through together. But there are also important questions of readiness of our forces. There are important questions of our ability to actually raise the necessary forces for particular missions. Those are vital things too. And finally, Dan, I would say that we also recognize that while it's very important that we remain true to the commitments that we all made as allies in 2014 in Wales, it's also true that different allies and partners who are not allies contribute to our security defined largely in many ways. And it's important, I think, for the United States to recognize that too. For example, development assistance is a vital part of security. And a number of our allies, a number of our partners make very significant per capita contributions to development. And so that's something we don't want to lose sight of either.
We'll go to Terry Schultz.
Hello, Mr. Secretary, up here. Terry Schultz for NPR. Thank you very much. Despite the improved atmosphere, there are still some pretty significant areas where the U.S. and its European allies and its partners at the EU are on different pages. Specifically on China, the Biden administration, before it was in office, sent out signals that they would like to see the EU wait on its investment deal, and that didn't happen. You'll be speaking with Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell later. Are you hoping to pull them more toward the U.S. view that they should not be doing business with China to the extent that European governments are at the moment? Are you concerned about this? And the other issue is Iran. The E3 would very much like to see you and Iran sit down. There was an invitation. I understand that the U.S. says it's waiting for Iran to make the first move. Iran says it's waiting for you to make the first move. I mean, why can't you come to an agreement to sit down and talk on this? What's the holdup? Thanks.
Good. Thank you. So first, with regard to the EU and particularly China, you're right. I have the opportunity actually this afternoon to sit down with our very close partners and the leadership. Maybe more important than that, President Biden is going to be speaking to the Council tomorrow via video. Both important, and especially the President, important evidence of our commitment to work closely with the European Union. We see the European Union as a partner of first resort on a broad array of issues, and China is one of them. We are looking very much forward to actually having close consultations between the United States and the EU on China. That'll be an opportunity to share the concerns that we have, including those related to trade, investment, human rights, and indeed, I'll have an opportunity to do that this afternoon with my counterparts. With regards to the comprehensive agreement on investment, our judgment is that the onus is really going to be on China to demonstrate that the pledges it's made on forced labor, on state-owned enterprises, on subsidies, are not just talk, and that the Chinese government will follow through on the commitments that it's made. So I suspect that not only will we be looking to that, but so will the European Union. But we'll also continue to engage with European counterparts, including members of the European Parliament, on how to advance our shared economic interests and to counter some of China's aggressive and coercive actions, as well as its failures, at least in the past, to uphold its international commitments. And I think, again, what's so important, both with regard to NATO and the issues we're dealing with, but also the EU and our partnership with the EU, is that when we are working together, when we are speaking with one voice, when we're acting together, we are much stronger and much more effective than if any single one of us is doing it alone. And so, for example, when it comes to dealing with some of China's practices in the commercial area and the trade and investment and economic area that we all object to, if the United States is taking those on its own, we're about 25% of world GDP. When we're actually working with our European partners, Asian partners, and others, we might be 40, 50, or 60% of world GDP. That's a lot harder for Beijing to ignore. So that's another reason why we are really focusing on revitalizing, recommitting to our alliances and partnerships. So with regard to Iran, we have been very clear that the path to diplomacy is open. And as you noted, when the EU suggested bringing together all of the participants in the JCPOA to look at how we might come back to compliance with the JCPOA, we said yes, and to date, Iran has chosen not to engage. So, as we've said, the ball is really in their court to see if they want to take the path to diplomacy and returning to compliance with the agreement. And should that happen, we would then seek, as we've said, to build a longer and stronger agreement, but also to engage on some of the other issues where Iran's actions and conduct are particularly problematic. Destabilization of countries in the region, ballistic missile program, et cetera. So I had a meeting last night with our E3 partners, with the UK, with Germany and France. We are all very much on the same page when it comes to Iran, when it comes to our common interest in seeing if Iran wants to engage in diplomacy, to come back fully into compliance with its obligations under the JCPOA. We are, again, prepared to engage on that. To date, Iran has not been, but let's see what happens in the weeks ahead.
Take a final question from Robin Emmett.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Robin Emmett from Reuters. You said yesterday that you had a bilateral with Germany's Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, and I wanted to ask you about Nord Stream. So the pipeline is almost complete. I wondered what you see as the solution in this issue, because Ambassador Ischinger has put forward this idea that construction could actually be completed, but there would be some kind of kill switch whereby gas could always be shut off if, say, Russia moved against Ukraine. So I wondered, first of all, was that discussed yesterday between you and yourself and Heiko Maas? Mm-hmm. And if not, what is a solution? Thank you.
Well, first let me say that Germany is among our closest allies, and we have a real disagreement on Nord Stream 2. That's not a secret to anyone, but we're not going to let that stand in the way of the work we're doing together on issue after issue that is of direct concern to the citizens of both of our countries. And indeed, I've had great conversations with Heiko Maas and German colleagues about the agenda that we have together, both as partners ourselves through NATO, the EU, at the UN, you name it. But it's also true that President Biden has been very clear for a long time in his view that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea. And I reiterated that view directly to Foreign Minister Maas. And I also made clear that firms engaged in pipeline construction risk U.S. sanctions.